The rhythmic clatter of wheels against rails used to lull me to sleep. Now it keeps me awake, each click-clack a reminder of the secret I wish I'd never uncovered. My name is Harold Blackwood, and after 15 years as the Royal Train's conductor, I've learned that some mysteries are better left buried in the fog that shrouds these Highland tracks. It started 3 months ago, on what should have been a routine midnight run to Edinburgh. The autumn air bit sharp through my uniform as I performed my usual pre-departure checks. Everything seemed normal, until I noticed the sealed cargo car. Not unusual in itself, but the guards posted at its doors certainly were. Their uniforms bore no insignia, their faces masks of practiced indifference. "Papers?" I asked, extending my hand as protocol demanded. The taller guard produced a document bearing the royal seal. My eyes widened. This wasn't the standard transit authorization, but a Class A clearance, the kind I'd seen only twice before in my entire career. Both times had involved transporting crown jewels to official ceremonies. "Everything's in order," the guard said, his tone brooking no discussion. "You have your instructions. No stops until Edinburgh." I nodded, knowing better than to question further. But as I walked away, something caught my eye. A faint greenish glow seeping through the car's window seams. I'd seen many strange things on these midnight runs, but never anything like that. The journey began smoothly enough. The passengers, all 6 of them, unusually few for even a midnight service, kept to their private compartments. The guards remained stationed at the cargo car, still as statues. But 2 hours into our journey, as we wound through the Highland valleys, the first anomaly occurred. The temperature in my cabin dropped suddenly, my breath misting in the air. The instruments flickered, needles dancing erratically before settling back to normal. And then I heard it. A sound that didn't belong among the familiar symphony of train noises. A low, pulsing hum, almost beyond the range of hearing, but I felt it in my bones. I reached for the internal communication line to contact my assistant conductor, James, who was making his rounds. The line crackled with static. "James, do you copy?" More static, then his voice, strained and unclear. "Harold, something's wrong with car 7. The readings are..." The line went dead. I checked my watch, 1:47 a.m. We were deep in the Highlands now, surrounded by nothing but mist-shrouded mountains and ancient forests. The nearest station was 40 minutes ahead. Protocol dictated that I maintain course unless there was a clear emergency, but something felt fundamentally wrong. The hum grew stronger, and with it came a vibration that seemed to resonate with something primitive in my mind. My hands trembled slightly on the controls, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt truly afraid on my own train. I had to know what was in that cargo car. Making a decision that would change my life forever, I engaged the autopilot, a modern addition to our historic train, and stepped out of my cabin. The narrow corridor stretched before me, shadows dancing in the dim emergency lighting. As I moved toward car 7, the hum became more pronounced and the air grew colder still. James was nowhere to be seen. When I reached car 6, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The guards were gone. The sealed doors stood unattended, that eerie green glow now clearly visible through the seams. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I approached the doors. That's when I heard it. A sound that haunts my dreams to this day. From within the cargo car came a series of sharp, metallic clicks, followed by what I can only describe as a whisper in a language that had no business existing in our world. I reached for the door handle, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Just as my fingers brushed the cold metal, a hand gripped my shoulder. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Blackwood." I turned to find myself face to face with a woman I'd never seen board the train. She wore a crisp black suit that seemed to absorb the light around it, and her eyes held secrets darker than the Highland night. "Some doors," she said, her voice soft but carrying an edge of steel, "are locked for a reason." I wanted to run, to return to my cabin and forget everything I'd seen. But as I looked into her eyes, I knew it was too late. I was already part of whatever this was, whether I wanted to be or not. And somewhere behind us, in that sealed car with its sickly green glow, something clicked and whispered in the darkness, counting down to a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The woman's grip on my shoulder remained firm as she guided me away from the cargo car. Her movements were fluid, practiced, like a dancer who'd rehearsed the same deadly choreography 1,000 times. "My name is Director Wells," she said, steering me toward the dining car. "And you, Mr. Blackwood, have just stumbled into something far above your pay grade." The dining car was empty, its polished wooden tables gleaming under the dim lights. She gestured for me to sit. I noticed her hands, elegant but marked with peculiar scars that seemed to shift in the shadows. "Where's James?" I demanded, finding my voice at last. "Your assistant conductor is fine. He's been temporarily relieved of his duties." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Now, we need to discuss what happens next." The train swayed gently as we curved around a mountain pass. Outside the windows, the Scottish Highlands were a dark mass against a starless sky. The ever-present hum from Car 7 seemed to pulse in time with my racing heart. "I've worked this line for 15 years, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know every regulation, every protocol. Whatever's in that car, it's not legal cargo, is it?" Director Wells pulled out a silver cigarette case, offering me one. I declined. As she lit her own, the flame cast strange shadows across her face. "Legal is a relative term, Mr. Blackwood, especially when dealing with artifacts of national security." She exhaled a perfect ring of smoke. "Tell me, in your 15 years, have you ever heard of Project Lazarus?" I shook my head, but something about the name sent a chill down my spine. The temperature in the dining car seemed to drop further. "Good. That means the compartmentalization has been working." She leaned forward. "But now that you've seen too much, we have two options. Option 1, you sign some papers, become part of the project, and continue your duties with a significant pay increase and some additional responsibilities." The hum from Car 7 grew louder. A glass on a nearby table began to vibrate. "And option 2? I asked, already dreading the answer. "Option 2 doesn't end well for anyone." Her smile remained fixed. "Especially given your family situation. How is young Timothy's schooling going? Oxford is expensive, I hear." My blood ran cold. Timothy was my son, a freshman at Oxford. The fact that she knew about him. Before I could respond, the lights flickered violently. The hum became a high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. Director Wells' expression changed for the first time. A flash of genuine concern crossed her face. She pressed her hand to an earpiece I hadn't noticed before. "Status report," she barked. Her eyes widened at whatever response she received. The train lurched suddenly, sending unused cutlery clattering to the floor. The whine from Car 7 reached a fever pitch. "Stay here," Director Wells commanded, rising swiftly. "Whatever you hear, whatever you see, do not leave this car." She moved toward the door with urgent grace, but paused at the threshold. "Mr. Blackwood, consider this your first test. Your cooperation now will determine whether you're suitable for option 1. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the increasingly disturbing sounds emanating from the cargo car. I should have stayed put. Should have followed orders like I had for 15 years. But then I saw James through the window of the connecting door, stumbling down the corridor of the adjacent car. His uniform was disheveled, and even through the glass I could see his face was ashen. He saw me too. His eyes went wide with recognition, and he mouthed something I couldn't make out. Then he pressed something against the window, a piece of paper with hastily scrawled words, "They lie. Check manifest, 1947. Before I could react, two figures in black suits emerged from the shadows behind James. They grabbed him by the arms and dragged him back into the darkness. He didn't resist. The manifest. Every train journey for the past century was documented in the archive car, 3 cars ahead. If there was a connection between whatever was happening now and something from 1947. The lights flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, I swore I saw something impossible reflected in the dining car window, a shape that defied description, writhing behind me in the shadows. When I spun around, nothing was there. But the air had changed, carrying the metallic taste of ozone and something else, something ancient and wrong. I had a choice to make: follow Director Wells's orders and stay put, protecting myself and Timothy's future, or find out what happened in 1947 that could explain the horror unfolding on my train tonight. The archive car was 3 cars ahead. The cargo car, with its sickly green glow and otherworldly whispers, lay between me and any answers I might find. The hum pulsed once more, and somewhere in the darkness, I heard Director Wells shouting orders, her voice tinged with something that sounded terrifyingly like fear. The decision made itself. I couldn't ignore James's warning, not after seeing the terror in his eyes. Moving as quietly as possible, I slipped out of the dining car and into the corridor. The temperature continued to drop as I approached Car 7. Ice crystals formed on the windows, creating intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly. The green glow had intensified, pulsing like a diseased heartbeat. Voices echoed from ahead, Director Wells and others, their words urgent but indistinct. I pressed myself into an alcove as 2 more black-suited figures rushed past, carrying what looked like scientific equipment. Their boots left strange marks on the carpet, marks that seemed to fade away seconds after they passed. I waited until their footsteps faded before continuing forward. The archive car was just ahead, but to reach it I'd have to pass directly by Car 7. As I drew closer, the whispers started again, but this time I could almost make out words, almost understand the impossible language that scratched at the edges of my sanity. Mr. Blackwood. I froze. But the voice hadn't come from behind me. It came from the cargo car itself, speaking my name in a voice that sounded like metal scraping on bone. Your son dreams of you. My heart nearly stopped. The voice, it couldn't be real. It was fear playing tricks on my mind. It had to be. Every night he dreams of trains, of tracks that lead into darkness. Would you like to know why? I forced myself to move, to put one foot in front of the other. The voice chuckled, a sound like breaking glass. The manifest holds the truth, Harold. About Timothy, about 1947, about why you were really chosen for this route. I broke into a run, passing the cargo car's doors. For a split second, I caught a glimpse through a gap in the seals. A flash of writhing shadows and green light that burned itself into my memory. Something moved behind those doors, something vast, compressed into an impossible space. I reached the archive car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the lock. My conductor's key still worked. Whatever was happening, they hadn't locked me out of the system yet. The archive car was a narrow space lined with filing cabinets, each containing decades of railway history. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and leather bindings. Under normal circumstances, I found this car peaceful. Now, it felt like a tomb. The cabinet for the 1940s was at the far end. I pulled it open, fingers rifling through files until I found what I needed. The manifest for that year was thicker than usual, bound in leather that felt wrong under my fingers. As I opened it, a photograph slipped out and fell to the floor. I picked it up, and my world tilted on its axis. The photograph showed a train crew from 1947. In the center stood a man who could have been my twin. Same height, same build, same eyes. The name beneath read Henry Blackwood, my grandfather. But that was impossible. My grandfather had died in 1945, 2 years before this photo was taken. I'd seen his death certificate, heard the stories of his passing. The manifest itself contained more impossibilities. Every midnight run in 1947 showed the same cargo description: Project Lazarus, Phase 1, the same destination, Edinburgh, the same conductor, Henry Blackwood. But it was the last page that made my blood run cold. A handwritten note, the ink still somehow fresh after all these years. The bargain is made. The bloodline is bound. Every generation will serve, willing or not. The tracks must run red. Below the note was a symbol I recognized, the same symbol I'd seen tattooed on Director Wells's wrist when she lit her cigarette. The train lurched again, more violently this time. The lights went out completely, plunging me into darkness. When they came back on seconds later, Director Wells stood in the doorway. "I warned you to stay put," she said softly. "Now I know you're not suitable for option 1. "What did my grandfather do?" I demanded. "What was Project Lazarus?" "Your grandfather made a choice, Mr. Blackwood. A noble choice to save thousands of lives. But choices have consequences, and debts must be paid." She stepped closer. "Your son's acceptance to Oxford wasn't coincidence. Nothing in your life has been coincidence." The whispers from Car 7 grew louder, more insistent. Director Wells checked her watch. "We're approaching the crossing point. What's in that car is going to wake up fully in exactly 7 minutes. And now, thanks to your curiosity, you've forced my hand." She drew a gun from her jacket. "The bloodline must continue, but perhaps through Timothy instead of you." The lights flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, I saw the truth in her eyes. She was as trapped as I was, serving something that had sunk its claws into both our families generations ago. I had 7 minutes to save my son from inheriting this nightmare. 7 minutes to break a bargain made in 1947. The whispers turned to screams. "You don't have to do this," I said, backing away from Director Wells's aimed gun. "Whatever bargain my grandfather made, it can't be worth all this." Her laugh was hollow. "Worth it? In 1947, your grandfather faced a choice. Let Project Lazarus proceed, or watch as half of Scotland succumb to something far worse than death. He chose to bind his bloodline to the railway, to become a guardian. Just as my grandmother chose to bind our family to oversight." The train shuddered. The temperature dropped so low that frost began forming on the files around us. "5 minutes until the crossing point," she said. "You should have just stayed ignorant, Harold. Some burdens are easier to bear when you don't understand them." A sound like tearing metal echoed through the train. Director Wells's radio crackled to life. "Ma'am, containment is failing. The seals are..." The transmission cut off in a burst of static and screaming. She kept the gun trained on me, but spoke into her earpiece. "Status report! Someone give me a status report!" The only response was that terrible whisper language, now coming through her earpiece. She ripped it out, her composure cracking. That's when I saw it. Behind her, reflected in the archive car's window. A shadow that shouldn't exist, rising up like smoke but moving with purpose. Before I could shout a warning, it wrapped around her like a living darkness. Director Wells fired the gun, but the shadow jerked her arm upward. The bullet shattered the overhead light, plunging us into darkness broken only by the sickly green glow now seeping through every window. I dove behind a filing cabinet as she struggled with the entity. Her voice changed, becoming a horrible harmony of her own and something else. "The bargain must be maintained. The crossing must be achieved. The bloodline must serve." Using the light from my phone, I frantically searched through the fallen files scattered across the floor. There had to be more about 1947, about what my grandfather had actually done. A page caught my eye, a technical diagram of the train from 1947, but not the whole train, just Car 7. The drawings showed something that looked less like cargo space and more like a containment chamber. Scrawled in the margins were equations and symbols that hurt my eyes to look at. And there, at the bottom, crossing point coordinates, 56 to 49N, 5 to 7W. I knew those coordinates. They marked a stretch of track that passed through the oldest part of the Highlands, where the mountains cast shadows that seemed to move independently of the sun. We were headed there now. "Your grandfather understood." Director Wells's voice came from the darkness, now completely transformed into that bone-scraping tone. "He saw what lies between worlds, what keeps the ancient bargains, what hungers." The shadow released her, and she crumpled to the floor. Her gun slid across the floor, stopping at my feet. The train's whistle blew. Not the normal sound, but a wail that spoke of endings and beginnings, of doors opening that should stay closed. 3 minutes to crossing," the thing wearing Director Wells's voice announced. "The vessel is prepared. The gateway awakens." I grabbed the gun and ran. The corridor outside was chaos. Emergency lights strobed, revealing glimpses of black-suited figures lying unconscious. Or worse. The air itself seemed to ripple with that nauseating green energy. I had to reach the engine. Had to stop the train before we hit the crossing point. But as I ran, I felt something change in the air pressure. My ears popped, and suddenly I could understand the whispers. They spoke of 1947, of a tier between worlds that opened in the highlands, of ancient beings that saw humanity as nothing but vessels and cattle, of my grandfather, who offered his bloodline as guardians in exchange for sealing the breach. But he had been clever, hiding something in the very bargain he struck. A weakness, a way out. The engine car was ahead. Through the windows, I could see we were approaching a curved stretch of track that wound between two mountains. The crossing point. I reached for the door handle but stopped as my phone buzzed. A text from Timothy. "Dad, something's wrong. I keep seeing trains in my dreams. Green lights, shadows. Please help." The thing that had possessed Director Wells spoke from behind me. The son is already part of this. The bloodline calls to him. You cannot break what was freely given. I turned to face it. In the strobing lights, Director Wells's form seemed to flicker between human and something else, something that had too many angles and edges. "My grandfather gave you his bloodline," I said, remembering the exact words from the manifest. "The tracks must run red." The thing tilted its head at an impossible angle. "Yes, the bargain is clear." "Then you should have been more specific," I said, raising the gun not at the creature, but at my own hand, because blood can run without death. A single drop freely given might seal a bargain. Its eyes widened with something like fear. "But blood freely taken," I continued, "breaks it completely." The train entered the crossing point as I pulled the trigger. Pain exploded through my hand as the bullet grazed my palm. Blood dripped onto the floor of the train. My blood, freely taken rather than freely given. The effect was instantaneous. The thing wearing Director Wells screamed in a frequency that shattered every window in the car. The green light pulsed violently, and the very air seemed to tear apart around us. Through the broken windows, I saw the Highland Mountains twist in ways that defied physics, their silhouettes forming impossible shapes against a sky that was no longer our own. "Fool!" the entity roared, its borrowed form dissolving into a writhing mass of shadows and angles. "You know not what you've done! The bargain held back the tide!" The train's wheels screamed against the rails as we hit the crossing point. Time seemed to stretch like taffy. Through the fractured reality around us, I saw other trains, ghost trains from other times, other bargains. In one, I saw my grandfather, his hands pressed against a window, mouthing words I couldn't understand. In another, I glimpsed Timothy, older, wearing a conductor's uniform, his eyes filled with the same green light we'd been transporting. My phone buzzed again. Timothy's messages came in rapid succession. "The shadows are here. They're showing me everything. Dad, I understand now. About grandfather, about you. You have to finish it. The blood must flow both ways." The entity lunged at me, its form now completely inhuman, a geometric nightmare of teeth and darkness. But as it reached for me, something held it back. Director Wells's body, crumpled on the floor, twitched and her eyes opened, now clear and human. "The Oversight family," she gasped. "We weren't just watching, we were containing. Your blood broke their hold, but mine can end this." She pulled a small knife from her boot, her movements fighting against invisible restraints. "Your grandfather, he knew this day would come. The bargain required two bloodlines, one to guard, one to end." The entity thrashed against invisible bonds as Director Wells dragged herself toward me, fighting for every inch. The train carriage groaned, metal warping under the pressure of forces it was never meant to contain. Through the broken windows, I saw we were approaching a bridge over a deep ravine, the exact spot marked in the 1947 diagrams. Not just a crossing point between places, but between realities. Timothy, I typed quickly, my injured hand leaving blood on the phone screen. Whatever you're seeing, don't look away. Remember who you are. Remember you're a Blackwood. Director Wells reached me, her knife hand shaking. Your blood broke the chains, she said. Mine will seal the door. But you have to complete the circuit. Take my knife. Finish what our family started. The entity's form began to stabilize, drawing power from the crossing point. Through its shifting mass, I saw glimpses of what lay beyond, a void filled with watching eyes and patient hungers. The boy is ours, it thundered. The bloodline is ours. This railway is ours. Director Wells pressed the knife into my hand. Choose, Harold. Choose better than our grandparents did. My phone buzzed one final time. Timothy's last message read, I trust you, Dad. The bridge was seconds away. The entity gathered itself for a final assault. Director Wells's eyes met mine, and I saw in them the same choice my grandfather must have faced. Sacrifice everything to save something, or save yourself, and lose everything. I gripped the knife. The entity laughed, a sound like breaking worlds. Even if you stop this crossing, we have marked the boy. His dreams will be our gateway, his mind, our vessel. But it had revealed too much. In its arrogance, it had shown its fear. No, I said, understanding flooding through me. Timothy's dreams aren't your gateway. They're his inheritance, his warning. Every Blackwood child dreams of trains because we're meant to be prepared, to be ready. I raised the knife, not toward the entity, but toward the ceiling of the train car. You never owned the bloodline. You never owned the railway. This was never about containing you. Director Wells's eyes widened as she realized the truth. It was about gathering you, she whispered. Getting all of you in one place. The entity's confidence faltered. What are you? My grandfather didn't make a bargain, I said. He laid a trap. And now, after 77 years, you're finally all here. I plunged the knife into the ceiling, completing a circuit that had begun in 1947. My blood mixed with Wells, and the metal of the train itself seemed to come alive with purpose. The bridge loomed ahead. And somewhere in Oxford, Timothy Blackwood looked into the shadows in his dreams and finally understood what it meant to be a railway man. The moment our blood touched the train's metal, every light in every car exploded in a cascade of sparks. The entity screamed, not in triumph this time, but in dawning comprehension and fear. The train itself began to change. Rust fell away from hidden sigils carved into every surface, symbols that had waited 77 years to be awakened. The metal walls rippled like liquid, revealing layer upon layer of carefully crafted spellwork disguised as ordinary engineering. Impossible! The entity roared, its form fracturing as it tried to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The train had become a cage, just as my grandfather had designed it to be. Director Wells laughed weakly beside me. All those years, we thought we were containing them with the bargain, but we were just gathering them. Every midnight run, every secret transport, bringing more of them into the trap. The bridge appeared through the broken windows, an iron giant spanning the Highland Chasm. But now I saw it clearly. The bridge's architecture wasn't just Victorian engineering. The struts and beams formed patterns that mirrored the sigils in the train, creating a vast circuit that had waited decades to be completed. My phone lit up with one final message from Timothy. The dreams aren't nightmares anymore, Dad. They're blueprints. I can see what great-grandfather built, what you need to do. The entity thrashed against the train's walls, its form splitting into dozens of smaller shadows, all the pieces it had collected over decades of midnight runs. You cannot unmake us! We are eternal, we are... You are passengers, I said, understanding flooding through me. And this is the last stop. I pressed my bleeding hand against the wall, and Director Wells did the same. The train's whistle blew one final time, but now it wasn't a sound of warning. It was a sound of completion, of victory. The bridge's iron bones began to sing. Everything happened at once. The train's wheels struck the bridge with a sound like a cathedral bell. The sigils in the walls blazed with light, not the sickly green of the entities, but a clean, bright silver that came from decades of preparation and sacrifice. The entities' fragments tried to flee, but they were drawn inexorably toward Car 7. The containment car hadn't been designed to hold them in, but to hold them together, to make them whole so they could be destroyed completely. "My grandmother," Director Wells gasped, her strength fading. "She wrote in her journal, Talax, about your grandfather's last words. Do you know what he said?" I shook my head. "The tracks don't just run between cities," she quoted. "They run between worlds. And sometimes you need to tear up the tracks." The bridge's iron latticework began to glow with the same silver light as the train. The entity howled as it was compressed into Car 7, forced back into a single form. "Timothy," I whispered, hoping somehow he could hear me. "I'm sorry for all the dreams, for the legacy we had to give you. But you'll never have to carry this burden. It ends tonight." The entity's voice boomed one last time. "If we die, the boy still dreams of us. The door remains." I smiled. "No, he dreams of trains, of his heritage, of the strength of the Blackwood line. The door you saw in his mind, it was never yours to open." The bridge reached its center point. Director Wells and I pressed our hands together, completing the circuit of 2 bloodlines, just as our grandparents had planned. "For the railway," she whispered. "For our families," I replied. The silver light erupted from every part of the train, from every beam of the bridge. The entity screamed as it was caught in a trap 77 years in the making. Car 7 imploded, taking the horror with it, erasing it not just from our world, but from all worlds. The train screeched to a halt at the bridge's far end. In the sudden silence, I helped Director Wells to her feet. Through the broken windows, we watched as the bridge's light faded, its purpose finally fulfilled. My phone buzzed one last time. Timothy had sent a picture, a drawing from his dream. It showed a train, but not one carrying darkness. This train's windows blazed with silver light, and at its helm stood 3 figures: a grandfather who gave his blood for a plan, a father who completed it, and a son who would dream not of horrors, but of heritage. Director Wells looked at her watch and laughed. "Right on schedule," she said. "The 147 to Edinburgh always arrives exactly when it's meant to." I looked back at the bridge, now just a bridge again. "What happens now?" "Now?" She smiled. "Now we do what railway folk have always done. We keep the trains running. But this time, we do it in the light." As if in response, the sun began to rise over the highlands, painting the sky in colors that belonged purely to our world. Somewhere in Oxford, I knew Timothy was waking up to his last supernatural dream and his first normal day. The track stretched ahead, leading not to darkness, but to dawn. If you enjoyed this tale of mystery and courage, remember, every train journey holds its own story, but some stories are written in blood and iron, passed down through generations, waiting for the right moment to reach their final station.